Thank you very much. There we go, made it. Thank you very much, and good evening, everybody. So my name is Billy, and this evening I'm going to be talking about the history of telephone numbers, particularly in Stoke Newington, and how they've evolved, and there's been quite a few changes. So welcome to my talk. It's really lovely to be here, and we will be looking at the telephone boundaries, how that's changed with those telephone number areas. You know, a lot of the boundaries kind of played a pivotal role in the telephone traffic from adjoining boundaries that kind of fed into Stoke Newington. And the GPO were very fortunate in that days, because in 1904 there was a piece of legislation that passed for them to govern all of the telephone lines and the wireless as well, for the broadcast, for the King's speech, for Winston Churchill, all those big speeches before TV came. So they could broadcast lots of these announcements to a wide amount of people. We'll then be looking at these specific telephone numbers in Stoke Newington at the exchanges, because the exchanges played a key role as well, because they all, you know, directed certain traffic, particularly if you were ringing from outside a telephone boundary for what we call a long distance call. Then hopefully we'll bring back some lovely nostalgia, and we're going to have a look through some telephone directories, which I'm hoping to bring back some memories. And just going through Stoke Newington is lovely, because some of these bygone era signs are still there that you'll see in my talk tonight, which is lovely to know of. So early telephones. In 1876, Alexander Graham Bell discovered the telephone. He worked in Massachusetts, America, for the School of Deaf, and it was kind of by accident he noticed sound waves could be pushed through a wire, you know, with the crank, lots of the batteries. And here we have a Gower Bell telephone, so it's quite an old telephone. A lot of them were intercom telephones at this time. So you can see she's got a speaking tube and then a receiver. So they were very simple, maybe just a few houses. So at this time particularly, you know, only a certain street would have a couple of houses. There'd be somebody upstairs with a little switchboard as well. In 1912 then, it became apparent that telephone was starting to build. So you had these large city exchanges, really extravagant buildings, and the GPO were very selective in their architects that they chose. There were floor plans A to J, believe it or not, that they had to abide by to house all of the equipment. So telephone exchange looked quite a standard building, but with architects fitting that in to the dynamics of the area to make it fit in with how the area looked as well. You also had West End exchanges, and obviously we can see here Stoke Newington hadn't really formed the boundary, so you've still got Hornsley and Dalston, those sorts of areas before it was formed. Looking more closely then, as you can see in the 1930s, you got all of the letters for the codes for exchange, and they were introduced in 1922 by directories, and we can see here the first 3 letters of each area. Now, not everywhere had a letter. You had to be within 11 miles radius of the centre of London. So a lot of these areas did help people out where they were calling to. You know, as these telephone numbers became popular, you know, for example, so we've got Stamford Hill area, STA, and then Clissold, CLI, so that's how it was, those boundaries, particularly for the telephone. And as I said, they didn't have any monopoly or any competition, so they could have kind of put up the boundaries, and the boundaries were ruled out really by the underground wiring, you know, the large trunk cabling that came from another exchange that fed traffic in to that particular area. In the 1950s, you might have opened up a directory like this and had a particular look. As you can see in bold, all of the numbers down here, letters, but they transcribed as numbers. But for the subscriber, you know, it was to help them identify the locations of areas. And, sorry, just before we go, you'll notice Clissold is mentioned up here, and that is because the exchanges up the top here were going through the process of being automatic. They hadn't yet with the Stroud, the armature, so click and bang it used to be known as in the exchanges. So they haven't been yet automated, so you would be waiting on the line. So don't get too frustrated, and please wait, because it could take longer. There was a queue forming with lots of other numbers ringing at the same time. So, Stoke Newington area then was quite interesting to look at because there was 4 telephone exchanges that kind of dominated that and played a pivotal role, as I said, directing telephone traffic in through those underground cables. So we've got Stamford Hill Telephone Exchange, which served particular numbers. So you had Latimer and Stamford Hill numbers that were governed by the Stamford Hill Telephone Exchange. Kingsland Green, which is just down by the station. Unless you're looking for telephone exchanges like me or the engineers, you probably wouldn't know where it is because normally they tend to be quite on the boundary, or they were dictated where the wires were. So actually sometimes you wouldn't find that the telephone exchange would be in that boundary at all. And quite in residential streets as well. So Kingsland Green served Clissold and Spartan numbers. Clapton Telephone Exchange is a fairly new one. So when System X came in, which was the digital switching in the 60s, automated became so much faster, so the digital switching really did increase. Partly, and that was great because all of it could be diverted, because a lot of the wires were touching. You might hear somebody else on the phone while you were trying to call somebody. They might have called the wrong number. So it was important that all of it was digital switched correctly. And then down here, we've got Hackney Telephone Exchange, which served Amherst numbers as well. And again, they all fed into the borough, and for long distance calls, they would be calling out as well. And as we can see here, in the 1960s, you've got the 01 geographical codes that started to come in. So you were getting these all-figure numbers, which must have been very confusing for people, because now all of a sudden, I'm seeing some nodded, now all of a sudden, you don't know where you're calling. The destination, so direct to inquiries, really started to have full force in its own switchboard in its own right, because people didn't know where they were calling. So 800 was given to Stamford Hill, and then you had all the street letter or numbers, and then after that, it was a first-come, first-served basis. So as you signed up for the telephone subscription service, your number would be added. And obviously, this did have the issues because numbers started to run out. In the 80s, the 0 played a really important role, because if you look at a telephone dial on the reverse, you'll have a pulse wheel. And this sent pulses down the line. So each telephone number that you dial has a different frequency and a different tone. And you might even hear that sometimes on feedback on your telephone. So the 0 was for a place value number to direct you to the exchange. This is just an overall then, what's underneath our feet, and as we drive or go on the bus. So the large bold lines would be your large cabling. So this would be taking traffic in for telephone wires from other outside boundaries within to the telephone exchange into the middle. Then you would have your distribution poles, which are your telephone poles that you will have seen down the street, perhaps. And a great example is Belgrade Road. As you're walking down, or I discovered, if you look on the floor, all of the local lines from the local houses will all have a footway cover that you walk along. So they'll be marked post office telephone sometimes, some of them PO, but they've been there since the 1930s, since it was first installed. So a lot of it is still using what we can today. So you've also got your DP poles, and but nowadays, obviously, you've got your PCP boxes, which are the green things at the end of your road, and that is a prime connection point. And then you've got your pulse modulars, so they're measuring the pulses that you're dialing. So actually, we don't need these telephone exchanges anymore. The GPO invested quite heavily into the exchanges, but all of it's done street by street. For example, you've got Stamford Hill Telephone Exchange. Just to look at these, this was a GPO design, so a selected architect for the government, because the Postmaster General was a government ministerial role till 1969, until the GPO dissolved into private, to go out and independent. This served Latimer and South Tottenham numbers, and then obviously in the 60s, the 01 code started to come in, which was a geographical code, particularly for London and lots of other areas Then you had the exchange code and then the following number afterwards, which would be the number. But you would only need the full code if you were ringing from outside, which I'm sure some of you will be aware. So it's on Haitian Road. And then obviously we've got your inner and outer numbers. So the 071 and 081s came in 1990s. 0171 was BT, British Telecom's big changeover day in 1995. And essentially they were running out of code, so they were getting a bit panicky. So they had to add this extra one in to enable more numbers to come up. So actually, telephone numbers have actually stayed the same. And if you go home tonight and look at your own numbers, you may see some of the remains of what it used to be in those numbers. Then 020, the largest cities came about, and then following after, lots of various other numbers, because they had more scope. It was run along broadband, which is dial-up, which I'm sure someone will remember too. These are pictures that I took when I came to visit Stoke Newington, and you can see these large hoist doors on the side of this particular Kingsland Green exchange, and they were to put the equipment in. It's too heavy to hoist up the stairs, if you like. So these hoist doors enabled those equipment that were kind of already installed in some cases to be put into those buildings. They were only ever used once, really, to put them in. And you'll see a lot of diesel stores, because obviously to get that winch going, they would use some of that. This particular exchange, Clissold, Spartan, Shackleton, Dalston and Kingsland numbers, so quite a heavy one. So you will see lots of telephone exchanges always look a bit odd. It always looks like some kind of DT project, because they've got lots of these brand new extensions, A lot of it tended to go up. Planning permission for the GPO wasn't an issue. It was when they dissolved in 1969, so they could kind of build where they wanted to. And then that became an all-figure number, 01 your code, and 249 for the exchange itself. Hackney Telephone Exchange. This served Amherst, Clapton Park, Hackney Wick and Homerton and Lower Clapton numbers. A very large exchange, but don't forget on top of that you had your emergency number, which came in 1937, and also when that all-figure number started to come in, you had the directory inquiries. So that was a large switchboard you needed just for that alone. As I mentioned, Clapton Telephone Exchange is the newer edition. So this was kind of built in the 60s, so they could reroute pretty much all of the numbers at seconds, lightning speed, much, much faster than the other exchanges. So a lot of them then were just used really for direct inquiries or emergency numbers, which were on a separate switchboard. And that was because there was a fire in Wimpole Street, which killed 5 women in total, so the GPO had to sit down and really consider. And actually 999 came about because of the numbers, very unique, and it's not likely to be confused with other numbers when you're dialing out. So it could be quite specific to get to the right place. Sometimes, the operators might still slip and put you through to the bakery or something. But on the whole, it worked. It was a much better system. A lot then had their own telephone emergency, in the police station, the fire. So actually the telephone was all around, really, in that time. Interesting to note, in 1947, Postmaster General, when it was a role of the government at that time, Wilfred Paling said in Parliament, "I can assure my right honourable friend that every effort is being made to improve the service at Clissold Exchange. On the technical side, the switchboard has been thoroughly renovated and extended, and constant attention is being given to the working of the junction lines to other exchanges. On the operating side, the bulk of the staff is of very short service and heavy losses in 1947. And let's remember, sadly, after the Second World War, not a lot of operators could return to work, partly because of their injuries, or maybe, there were some other reasons they were still out at war. So there was a real push for telephone operators at that time, particularly women, because women were said to have the kinder, softer voice. So it was really targeted at them, and then the males would be silly and muck about, so they would do the night duty. So that's kind of how those work periods time had worked, really. Looking at a telephone then that you may have come across in the 1930s, as we can see on this particular dial, you've also got the letters. So still at this point, we're using letters to identify, codes of the exchanges pinpointed at the locations. And in this directory drawer, you could have your really important numbers, such as the doctor, because the doctor would come out and visit you at any hour. You would also have a family doctor mainly. You might also have particular shops or butchers. And after the war, they kind of stopped making the drawers because they were a bit of an expense. So they cut back on that one. Interestingly, no bells. This was before bells, so this is 1909. Bakelite came to the market by Leo Bakerland, who came up with this formula. So the bells would be on a wall set. In 1939, they did make the King Pyramid, so it's a mounted bell set. In the 1950s, this is the most recognisable telephone that would have had, the bells came back into the telephone. And this was really helpful because it took up less space on the walls. And as you can see, you've still got all of your figure numbers. If you were very fortunate, you would have an ivory colour. And this ivory colour represented, at that specific time, 4 million subscribers alone in London. So you could also get jade green and red in those Bakelite colours too. This is a 1960, one of the last telephones really to have letters around the bezel. Because after that, obviously, we know it went to all figure numbers, and then directory inquiries started to kick in because that was really important. 1965, yellow pages were born, so they could print out lots of pages, and you could ring up, add your number to the book if you so wished, and that was distributed. So the GPO did invest a lot in their ones. I'm lucky enough to own these trade directories from the particular area of Stoke Newington and London as a whole. They sort of covered different areas. I've got these from house clearances. Many people just owned specific ones throughout their lifetime, which has kept them in great condition. And that was because a lot of people stayed at home, were self-employed. They would trade order all of their materials through these trade directories. And some I've purchased myself, but yeah, a lot of them just one owner. And I really like to trace back who's had them and, used them and where they were kept. So we'll go through some of these now, looking through, and I've picked a few. There were so many, I could have picked loads, but I had to, obviously ensure. So you can see here lots of past, quite heavy on the text, some of these, and that was because printing was at a premium. It was quite expensive to print images back then. You've got commercial ones as well, so you've got Clissold numbers, as you can see. So in your directory, it would mention CLI, and then you would have your following number. So you only had one code at that specific time. Again, more house shop renovation industries, and obviously Stoke Newington has changed, same with all over London really, some of those industries. Again, commercial, but this one's interesting to note because it's got two lines. And what that meant was, in the telephone exchange, you had two lines to a combination of 1,000. So actually, you had many different switchboards, and it had to be an even amount of numbers on the switchboard for it to work, a bit like a bingo card, is how I explain it to people. But there were two lines to 1,000 combinations, and you could get 3 lines, and it went all the way up to 10 lines in total. So you could tell how busy a particular area was by just knowing that little bit of information. I picked out this advert because it's quite a visual one, lots of interesting imagery going on, and you'll notice it's a 3 line. So again, it was needing a different switchboard, but this particular number obviously was still, an important one. 1947, so the adverts are starting to change. You're starting to get more imagery on the printing. The font sizes are different. People had more than one telephone to different directories, being a bit cheeky to try and get more interest and telephone calls. Different shop fronts, and as you can see, different types of fonts here as well. Again, Some of these you will still see because they've got bygone era, some of the signage. But it's always nice to look back, and it's mentioning 3 lines here as well at 2. Quilts, yeah, so some of these industries aren't kind of really around anymore, but obviously they took a lot of pride. So lots more numbers were being added daily, almost. Too much for them to keep up with, really, for the GPO. Home decorating and plumbing in the 1950s. Again, some more kind of building industries. Motoring, and I particularly like this one. If you wanted to go to East Anglia, you could, on the grey green coaches, as motor travel was becoming more and more popular in the 50s, people were venturing out of their boroughs. They could now afford a long-distance call, so they were using that to their advantages. Laundrettes, still quite popular in some areas, indeed, so that's quite a nice one to see. Retail, as that was starting to pick up. Publishing as well, like the Hackney Gazette you've got here as well, and that's a Clissold number. Shop fronts, and thank you so much to Amir, because actually this paints a lovely picture of how they've developed. So you've got the 01 geographical code, then the exchange code, and then the number itself. So you'd only need that exchange code if you were outside. Now, if you were passing on the bus, that would be ideal. If you're on a double-decker or a route master at that time, you might have seen that number, quickly jot it down, Mum, I'll ring them back later when you got home or whatever. So that was quite nice. So you can see some just have the codes, because as it got longer and longer, people can only see a few seconds. So you've got to really incorporate, a snapshot of the industries. Again, 071 in 1990s, the inner and outer London codes. And the codes all had meanings. So 0 was operator, and that still is present today. You had the 00 for international. The first international exchange was Faraday Telephone Exchange in 1933. So that was quite, you could start to ring out to places like Australia and amazing places, and that was all run on radio waves. The first Atlantic cable came in 1956, where, yes, they did lay it all the way to Canada, and it's still probably under the Atlantic now somewhere. 01 and 02 became your geographical codes. In 2000, it changed to 02, the London area. For all of London, they could cover because it travelled alongside the broadband internet. So that was a lot more faster. 03 could be reserved to 06. So if you wanted a particular number to set up and pay for that number for people to memorise, you could ring them up and get that organised. 07 mobile telephones, and that's still today. That's off radio signal, so that's a completely different system altogether. That's on those discs that you might see on the top of the buildings that look a bit concave, and they kind of just stick up like this. Free phone numbers, particularly when kiosks started to come about, you had the 0800 numbers, and that was a free phone, so you could ring somebody back. So you could go to a kiosk if they had that number, because even telephone kiosks were linked up to the exchange. And then 09 was your premium service. If we look now specifically, as a kind of summary of my talk, particularly looking back, so this was a building merchant in Stoke Newington. So 15 was the overall number, that beginning number. Then your CLI, 3455, it became. Then in the 60s, we know the geographical code was 01 for all of the area, followed by the exchange, and then the number. In the 90s, you've got the 07 and 08 split. In 1995, the big changeover day from British Telecom, where they added an extra 1. The 020 came in 2000, and then in 2019, they were also running out of numbers again, so they didn't really learn from their errors. So you might see some numbers with, 7 on the end or 3 on the end to try and use up, but actually they didn't really need the codes as much back then. So just a reflection then of how the boundaries have really changed. You've got the inner and outer suburbs of London. VoIP, so this is Voice over Internet Protocol, so running alongside. 020 is all of the London area, and all of the outer suburbs were 01 codes. So and a lot of them didn't change. It was only really London because there were so many subscribers. A little video now, just to reflect, if you were a subscriber, kind of what would happen.
Hello? 60957.
Good morning, the exchange here. Just testing the line. Have the engineers left your directory and a dial code list? Thank you.
Okay, so that was just a little snapshot. Thank you so much for listening. Please do follow me on Instagram. I love to hear the stories of the old telephones you've had. And this is just an interest of mine. I have a job on the side as well. So this is just, something to keep me busy, really. And thank you so much for listening. And then, any questions or comments, please do feedback. Thanks so much for listening, everybody. So, thank you, everybody.